Few teams carry the weight of history quite like the Toronto Maple Leafs. With a legacy stretching back over a century, they have become more than just a franchise. They're a symbol of hockey's roots and evolution. From the glory days of the 1940s and the last Stanley Cup in 1967, to decades of struggle and modern-day superstardom with Austin Matthews, the Leafs story is one of passion, pressure, and an unbreakable bond with one of the most devoted fan bases in sports. This is the entire history of the Toronto Maple Leafs. The history of the Toronto Maple Leafs begins alongside the start of the NHL itself. In the 1910s, Toronto was already a hockey city. It had a successful pro team in the National Hockey Association called the Toronto Blue Shirts, which were owned by Eddie Livingstone. However, arguments between Livingstone and the other NHA owners caused problems. In November 1917, the other owners decided to shut down the NHA and start a new league, the National Hockey League, without Livingstone. Since the league needed a team in Toronto, the NHL gave a temporary franchise to the Toronto Arena Company, which owned the Arena Gardens. This quickly put together team was just called Toronto, but people often refer to them as the Toronto Arenas due to their ownership. Coached by Dick Carroll, the Toronto team surprised many in the NHL's first season. They finished second in the regular season, then beat the Montreal Canadiens in the NHL playoffs to earn a chance to play for the Stanley Cup. In March 1918, Toronto played the Vancouver Millionaires in the Pacific Coast Hockey Association Finals and won the series 3-2, winning the Stanley Cup in the first season. Players like Greg Noble and Harry Cameron were key on the ice, and the goaltender Hap Holmes helped them lead to victory. The team captain, Jack Adams, who would later become well known as a coach and general manager in Detroit, scored the cup-winning goal. Because of legal issues with Eddie Livingstone, the 1918 Toronto team never was put on the Stanley Cup, a strange detail from an otherwise great beginning. In October 1918, the NHL made the Toronto franchise permanent. However, the team's owner, the Arena Company, had financial problems, partly due to the ongoing legal battles with Eddie Livingstone. The team struggled in its second season, the 1918-19 season, in which they played poorly and did not return to the finals. That year's Stanley Cup final was eventually cancelled due to the Spanish flu pandemic. With the team facing money issues, the franchise was sold in late 1919 to a Toronto-based group led by Herbert Vernkobe and Fred Hambley. The new owners renamed the team to the Toronto St. Patricks, or often shortened to the St. Pats, to appeal to Toronto's Irish community. The change came in time for the 1919-20 season and also introduced new green uniforms, replacing the blue worn by the arenas. With a fresh ownership and new identity, the Toronto team aimed to build a stronger foundation as the NHL entered the 1920s. The early 1920s saw the Toronto St. Patricks trying to find consistency in a very small NHL, which had only 4 to 6 teams during those years. The 1919-20 season, their first as the St. Pats, was quite forgettable as the team finished in last place. In 1920-21, however, Toronto bounced back and finished second in the NHL. Star forward Babe Dye emerged as one of the league's top scorers, and Toronto advanced to the NHL final against the first place Ottawa Senators. Toronto came up short, losing the 2-game total goal series to Ottawa, who went on to win the Stanley Cup. Still, Babe Dye's performance, scoring 33 goals in 24 games, made him a standout player and gave fans hope for the future. Those hopes paid off in the 1921-22 season, which turned out to be a great season for the St. Patricks. Toronto once again finished second in the regular season, but got hot in the playoffs. First, they pulled off an upset in the NHL playoffs, winning a close 2-game total goals series 5-4. They then traveled west to face the Vancouver Millionaires for the Stanley Cup, led by Babe Dye, who scored an incredible 11 goals in 7 playoff games, and goaltender John Ross Roach. Toronto won the 1922 Stanley Cup by defeating Vancouver 3-2. This was the franchise's second Stanley Cup, but the first under the St. Patrick's name. After their 1922 championship, the St. Patrick's stayed competitive, but couldn't repair their success right away. They missed the playoffs in 1923 and 24, as Ottawa and Montreal were the top teams in the league. By the mid-1920s, the St. Pats were starting to age and were dealing with financial problems. A bright spot came in 1924 when Ace Bailey joined the team. He would later become an important figure in the Maple Leafs history. The team managed to make the playoffs in 1924-25 seasons, but didn't reach the finals. Off the ice, things were getting worse. Team owner Fred Hambley was struggling financially, and by the late 1926, the St. Patrick's were up for sale. There was a serious chance the team could be bought by a group from Philadelphia and be moved out of Toronto. That's when Conn Smythe stepped in. A passionate young businessman and former military officer, Smythe led a local group determined to keep the team in Toronto. On Valentine's Day 1927, Smythe's group bought the St. Patrick's for $160,000, just beating out the Philadelphia bidders. Smythe quickly renamed the team to the Toronto Maple Leafs, a name that would become iconic. There are many different stories about where the name came from. One says he chose it to honor the Maple Leaf Regiment he served with in World War I. Another says he was inspired by a minor league Toronto team he once scouted. Either way, the name had a strong patriotic meaning. The team's colors, which had been green and white under the St. Pat's, were changed in 1927 to blue and white. These colors were already used by other Toronto sports teams, and Smythe said he chose it to represent the Canadian skies and snow. These are still the colors the Maple Leafs wear today. On the ice, the late 1920s were a rebuilding period for the newly renamed Toronto Maple Leafs. Conn Smythe took over as general manager and even coached the team for a short time. The 1926-27 season, which was split between playing as the St. Pat's and the Maple Leafs, ended with Toronto in the last place. The 1927-28 season, their first full year as the Maple Leafs, also finished with a losing record and no playoff appearance. Still, Smythe was working hard to reshape the team. One of his smartest moves came in 1927, when he acquired a young defenseman named Hap Day, who would later become team captain and eventually coach the Leafs to championships. In 1930, Smythe made a major trade to get star defenseman King Clancy from the Ottawa Senators. He gave up a large amount of cash and players in what was known as one of the biggest NHL deals at the time. The trade brought instant leadership and excitement to the team. By the 1928-29 season, the Maple Leafs began to improve. They finished second in their division and won a playoff round before losing in the semifinal. As the 1920s came to a close, Smythe began looking for a better venue to host a growing fanbase. He famously said that Toronto needed a new arena to match the team's rising popularity. Behind the scenes, he was already planning what would become the Maple Leaf Gardens, the iconic arena that would open in the early 1930s and mark the start of a new era for the franchise. The 1930s began with a major milestone for the franchise, the opening of Maple Leaf Gardens. Conn Smythe led the effort to build a new arena in Toronto, securing financing during the Great Depression and completing construction in just 5 months. Maple Leaf Gardens officially opened on November 12, 1931, with the Maple Leafs playing their first game there against the Chicago Blackhawks, which resulted in a 2-1 loss. The arena, which seated around 13,000 fans, quickly became the heart of hockey in Toronto. It earned the nickname the Carlton Street Cash Box because of its regular sellout crowds, and later became known as the sacred place for hockey fans. The Leafs didn't take long to find success in their new home. The 1931-32 season, their first full year at the Maple Leaf Gardens, turned out to be a standout. The team was powered by the famous Kid Line, a group of young stars made up of Charlie Conacher, Harvey Jackson, and Joe Primeau. All in their early 20s, the Kid Line gave the team a dynamic offense. Behind the bench was coach Dick Irvin, who had been hired by Smythe in 1931. That season, the Leafs finished second in the regular standings and made a strong playoff run. In the semifinals, they beat the Montreal Maroons in a tough series that ended with a dramatic 6-overtime win in the deciding game. In the 1932 Stanley Cup Final, Toronto faced the New York Rangers, a matchup Conn Smythe especially looked forward to, as he had coached the Rangers in the late 1920s. The Maple Leafs were dominant, sweeping the Rangers in 3 straight games to win the 1932 Stanley Cup, the franchise's third overall. Team captain Hap Day lifted the cup, and the Kid Line, especially Charlie Conacher, who led all players in playoff scoring, secured their place in Leafs history. The 1932 championship was extra special, as it was the first under the Maple Leafs name, and it came in the inaugural season at the Maple Leaf Gardens. Following their 1932 championship, the Maple Leafs became regular contenders throughout the rest of the 1930s. Conn Smythe kept building the team by adding strong players, including tough defenseman Red Homer, and by the mid-1930s, a talented young center named Sil Apps. Apps joined in 1936 and soon became team captain, setting the tone for the club both on and off the ice. The Leafs made it to the Stanley Cup Final 6 more times in the 8 seasons after 1932. However, most of those trips ended in heartbreak. Toronto often ran into other rising teams and lost in the finals in 1933, 35, 36, 38, 39, and 40. Each loss had its own story. In 1933, the Leafs lost in overtime to a goal by Rangers legend Bill Cook. In 35, Maroons goalie Alex Connell shut Toronto down. And 1938 stung the most, as the Blackhawks had a losing regular season but upset the Leafs in the final. Despite those disappointments, the Leafs stayed among the NHL's elite. Maple Leaf Gardens remained packed and fans stayed loyal, following every near miss an exciting run. The rivalry with the Montreal Canadiens also grew stronger during the 1930s, as the two teams battled for hockey supremacy, though strangely, they didn't meet in the Stanley Cup final during that decade. One especially emotional moment came in December 1933, when star player Ace Bailey suffered a career-ending head injury. After being hit from behind by Boston's Eddie Shore, Bailey nearly died from a fractured skull. In February 1934, the NHL held its first ever All-Star benefit game at Maple Leaf Gardens to raise money for Bailey. During the event, the Leafs retired Bailey's number 6, the first ever number to be retired in professional hockey. The game drew huge attention and showed just how much respect hockey had in Toronto. By the end of the 1930s, the Maple Leafs were a strong team, going through some changes. Longtime coach Dick Irvin was fired in 1940 after a disagreement with Conn Smythe. Irvin quickly joined the Canadiens, adding fuel to the growing rivalry between the two teams. Irvin's replacement was former Leafs captain Hap Day. The team's lineup was also shifting. Stars like Charlie Conacher and Busher Jackson had moved on, but Sil Apps had taken over as the team's leader. A new generation was starting to rise, including winger Gord Drillen and goaltender Turk Broda, who would help lead the Leafs into the 1940s. By this point, Toronto had firmly established itself as one of the NHL's model franchises, competitive on the ice, financially stable, and backed by one of the league's most passionate fan bases. The stage was set for the Maple Leafs to enter the NHL's original 6 era, where even greater success awaited. The 1940s began with a major shift in the NHL. In 1942, the league contracted just to 6 teams, starting the era now known as the Original 6. The Maple Leafs entered this period as one of the top clubs, and the decade would bring them incredible playoff success, including what many consider the greatest comeback in hockey history. After losing the Stanley Cup Finals in 1938, 1939, and 1940, and being upset in the first round of the 1940-41 playoffs, the Leafs were under pressure, but those failures set the stage for something unforgettable. In 1941-42 season, the Maple Leafs reached the Stanley Cup Final once again, this time facing the Detroit Red Wings. Things started terribly, as Toronto lost the first 3 games of the best-of-7 series. No team had ever come back from an 0-3 deficit in a Stanley Cup Final. Desperate to shake things up, coach Hap Day, with Conn Smythe's full support, made bold changes. He benched star forward Gordie Drillen and defenseman Bucko McDonald, replacing them with lesser-used players. And the gamble paid off. Toronto won Game 4 to stay alive, then crushed Detroit 9-3 in Game 5. They edged out a tight win in Game 6, setting up a decisive Game 7 at Maple Leaf Gardens. On April 18, 1942, in front of a roaring home crowd, the Maple Leafs completed the impossible comeback, beating Detroit 3-1. It remains the only time in Stanley Cup history that a team has come back from a 3-0 series deficit to win the championship. This comeback became legendary in hockey history, and the 1942 Maple Leafs earned a lasting reputation for resilience and determination. Sil Apps, the team captain and a hard-working two-way center, had a standout series. Wingers Sweeney Schreiner and Don Metz became unexpected heroes by scoring key goals, and goalie Turk Broda shut the door in the final games. The Leafs' comeback against Detroit is still one of the most dramatic and inspiring moments in all of sports. The 1942 championship marked the beginning of Toronto's true dynasty. By then, the NHL had shrunk to 6 teams due to financial struggles and World War II. Many players left to serve in the military, and as a result, the overall talent in the league was much thinner. Even Sil Apps, the Leafs captain, missed 2 full seasons, 1943-44 and 1944-45, while serving in the military. Because of these challenges, the Leafs had some tough seasons in the mid-1940s, but they kept developing young talent. One standout was Ted Kennedy, a hard-working center who joined the team as a teenager in 1943. He learned from the veterans and quickly became a key part of the lineup. Despite the roster changes during the war, Toronto managed to win another Stanley Cup in 1944-45 season. In that playoff run, Walter Turk Broda, who had been exempt from military service, was solid in the net. Up front, players like Gay Stewart and Kennedy led the offense. In the Stanley Cup final, Toronto pulled off a major upset by defeating the heavily favored Montreal Canadiens, who had dominated in the regular season. That 1945 victory proved that the Leafs' championship spirit was still alive, even with a younger squad. By the late 1940s, with the NHL played back to full strength after the war, the Maple Leafs built one of the hockey's greatest dynasties. Under coach Hap Day and general manager Conn Smythe, Toronto won the Stanley Cup 3 times in a row, from 1947 to 1949, becoming the first team in the modern NHL era to win 3 straight championships. The Leafs roster in those years were full of talent. Kyle Apps returned from military service and continued to dominate before retiring after the 1948 Cup win. Theodore Kennedy, now in his early 20s, emerged as a clutch performer and took over as team captain. He would later win the Hart Trophy in 1955 for his leadership. The Leafs also made a huge trade in 1947 to acquire Max Bentley, a former scoring champion who added speed and skill to the team. On defense, the Leafs had standout players like Babe Pratt and Bill Barilko, a tough and fearless defender. Turk Broda, now a 2-time Vezina Trophy winner, was a steady presence in goal. In the 1946-47 final, the Leafs beat the Montreal Canadiens, getting revenge for past playoff losses. In 1947-48, they swept the Detroit Red Wings, and in 1948-49, they did it again, sweeping Detroit for their 3rd straight cup. That 1949 win made Toronto the first NHL team to win 3 consecutive championships. Ted Kennedy scored the cup-winning goal in 1948 and was a major force throughout all 3 title runs. These victories against teams like the Montreal Canadiens and Detroit deepened those rivalries, with the Toronto-Montreal matchup being the NHL's biggest showdown, often deciding who would take home the cup. One of the most legendary chapters in the Maple Leafs history came at the start of the 1950s, during the 1950-51 season. That year, Toronto made it back to the Stanley Cup final, and once again, against the Montreal Canadiens. The series was unforgettable. All 5 games went to overtime, the only time in NHL history that every game of a final needed extra time. The Maple Leafs won the cup in Game 5 thanks to an iconic goal by defenseman Bill Barilko. He jumped into the play and scored the winning goal while flying through the air, a moment that looked like something out of a movie. Tragically, that would be the last game Barilko ever played. In the summer of 1951, he disappeared during a fishing trip in North Ontario when the small plane he was in crashed. The wreckage wasn't found for 11 years. During that time, the Leafs didn't win another championship. A dry spell fans became calling the Barilko Curse. Remarkably, the next time they won the Stanley Cup was in 1962, the same year Barilko's remains were discovered. The 1951 Stanley Cup was Toronto's 4th in 5 years, capping an incredible run of dominance in the late 1940s and early 50s. It also marked the end of an era for many Leafs greats. Kyle Apps had retired in 1948, and after, in 1951, Ted Kennedy began to step back from the spotlight. He would later on retire in 1955. Coach Hap Day moved into the front office role and was replaced behind the bench by Joe Primeau, a former Leafs star center. By the end of the 1940s, the Maple Leafs had firmly established themselves as a powerhouse, winning 5 Stanley Cups in the decade, in 1942, 45, 47, 48, and 49. The franchise had become known for its strong culture, passionate fanbase, and ability to shine in big moments. They entered the 1950s as reigning champions, but with an aging core and tough rivals like the Canadiens and Red Wings on the rise, new challenges were just around the corner. The 1950s were a decade of transition for the Toronto Maple Leafs. After their storybook Stanley Cup win in 1951, marked by Barilko's dramatic overtime goal and his tragic disappearance that summer, the team entered a long championship drought. Toronto didn't win another cup for the rest of the decade. Many superstitious fans blamed this on the so-called Barilko Curse, believing the team was somehow hexed by the loss of their young star. Whether or not one believes in curses, the Leafs clearly hit a rough patch by their high standards. Several key reasons contributed to their struggles in the 1950s. First, many of the players from the 1940s Dynasty either retired or were moved. Still, Apps was already gone, and in 1951, longtime captain Ted Kennedy stepped away. Legendary goalie Turk Broda played his final season in 1951-52. Defenseman Babe Pratt had already left the team, and the loss of Barilko left a major gap on the blue line. Meanwhile, the rival, Montreal Canadiens were on the rise, building a dominant roster that would take over the league in the second half of the decade. Despite these challenges, the Leafs stayed competitive in the early 50s, thanks to some promising new players. Frank Mahovlich, a tall and skilled winger, joined the team in the late 1950s and offered hope for the future. He won the Calder Trophy as an NHL Rookie of the Year in 1958. Before him, Howie Meeker had won the Calder in 1947 and contributed for several seasons, but overall, Toronto wasn't collecting many of the league's top individual honors during this time, aside from his rookie award. In goal, the torch was passed to Al Rollins, and later, Harry Lumley. Lumley had a standout season in 1953-54, winning the Vezina Trophy with the Leafs. Behind the bench, coach Joe Primeau couldn't match the success of Hap Day and resigned in 1953. He was replaced by King Clancy, another beloved former Leafs player, though the team still struggled to find its championship form. Toronto's best chances to reclaim the championship glory in the 1950s came in the 1958-59 and 1959-60 seasons. In both these years, the Maple Leafs made it all the way to the Stanley Cup final. A new generation of players was starting to take shape, including Frank Mahovlich, team captain George Armstrong, goaltender Johnny Bower, defenseman Carl Brewer, and a young center named Dave Keon. In 1959, the Leafs were coached by Punch Imlach, who had been brought in mid-season as both head coach and general manager. Toronto reached the final but faced a powerhouse, the Montreal Canadiens team, led by legends Maurice Rocket Richard and Jean Beliveau. Montreal defeated Toronto in 5 games. The following year, in 1960, the Leafs returned to the final, but were again swept in 4 straight games by the Montreal Canadiens. At the time, Montreal was in the middle of a 5-year dynasty, winning 5 straight Stanley Cups, so while the Leafs were improving, they couldn't yet get past their biggest rival. Still, the late 1950s Maple Leafs were clearly on the rise. Punch Imlach's leadership marked a major turning point. He brought a strict, old-school approach and gradually built a team in his image. By the 1959-60 season, despite the loss in the final, the Leafs featured a mix of emerging stars and veterans. Dave Keon, who would go on to win the Calder Trophy as Rookie of the Year in 1961, and other key contributors including Alan Stanley and Bob Bulford. One of the team's smartest moves was acquiring goaltender Terry Sawchuk, a future Hall of Famer who went to form a tandem with Johnny Bower. This 2-goalie system would become a major strength in the coming decade. Off the ice, a major shift happened in 1957, when longtime owner Conn Smythe began selling off his stake in the team. By 1961, he had fully sold his shares in Maple Leaf Gardens Limited to a group made up of his sons, Stafford Smythe, newspaper owner John Bassett, and Vancouver businessman Harold Ballard. This trio would lead the team into a new era. Conn Smythe's departure in 1961 marked the end of an era. He had been the face of the franchise since taking over in 1927, but he left behind a solid foundation. In truth, the transition had already started, as Stafford Smythe had been involved in team operations since the late 1950s. It was under his watch that Punch Imlach was hired, and the roster began to evolve into a contender once again. As the 1950s came to a close, the Maple Leafs fans were proud of the team's back-to-back appearances in the Stanley Cup final, but they were also eager to see the end of what had become an 11-year championship drought. The team hadn't won the cup since 1951. What they didn't realize though was that the foundation for a new era of success was already being laid. The momentum from the Maple Leafs Stanley Cup final appearances in 1959 and 1960 carried into the 1961-62 season. Toronto had built a well-balanced roster made up of seasoned veterans and rising young stars. On offense, the Leafs were led by Frank Mahovlich, a dynamic goalscorer in his mid-20s and one of the most skilled forwards in the league. Alongside him was Dave Keon, an outstanding two-way center who was only a few years into his career, but already making a big impact. Captain George Armstrong brought leadership and timely goals, while Bob Bulford, Red Kelly, added depth and grit to the forward lines. Defensively, the team was anchored by Alan Stanley and Tim Horton, a tough, reliable defenseman who was both a fan favorite and a future Canadian icon, thanks to his famous donut chain. Carl Brewer, a talented young blue liner, also played a key role. In goal, the Leafs had a powerful tandem with Johnny Bower and Terry Sawchuk, two experienced elite netminders who gave Toronto a major edge between the pipes. In the 1961-62 season, the Toronto Maple Leafs finally broke through the dominance of the Montreal Canadiens and Detroit and made it back to the Stanley Cup final. This time, they faced the defending champion, the Chicago Blackhawks. The Leafs defeated Chicago in 6 games to win the 1962 Stanley Cup, ending an 11-year championship drought, the first cup since 1951. The victory was incredibly meaningful. Not only did it end the long wait since Barilko's famous goal in 1951, but it also came just weeks before Barilko's plane wreckage was discovered that summer, a coincidence that fans couldn't ignore, especially those who believed in the Barilko Curse. On the ice, the 1962 final saw standout performances from Dave Keon and Frank Mahovlich. Goaltender Johnny Bower had a remarkable showing, including a shutout in Game 6 to clinch the cup. Red Kelly, a former Detroit star who had been acquired by Toronto and moved to center, was a key difference maker with his leadership and timely scoring. Conn Smythe, witnessing his last Leafs championship as he would pass away in 1980, famously remarked that winning the 1962 Cup was as thrilling as his first. But the Leafs weren't finished. They went on to build a mini dynasty, winning the Stanley Cup in 3 consecutive seasons, 1962, 1963, and 64. In 1962-63, Toronto finished first in the regular season, then beat the Montreal Canadiens in the semifinals and Detroit Red Wings in the finals to defend their title. They repeated defeat in 1963-64, once again defeating Detroit in a hard-fought 7-game series. One of the defining moments of the 1964 Cup was Bobby Baun's legendary overtime goal in Game 6. Baun, a tough defenseman, had broken his ankle earlier in the game, but returned to the ice to score the game-winning goal in overtime, forcing a Game 7 that Toronto won. This moment perfectly captured the grit and determination of Imlac's Leafs. Dave Keon's performance during the period was exceptional. In 1963, he won the Lady Byng Trophy for sportsmanship and skill. A few years later, in 1967, he would win the Conn Smythe Trophy, marking another high in his career. By the mid-1960s, the Toronto Maple Leafs had won 4 Stanley Cups in 6 seasons, firmly re-establishing themselves as one of the top NHL teams. Their core lineup, including Dave Keon, Frank Mahovlich, George Armstrong, Tim Horton, Alan Stanley, and Bob Pulford, was in its prime. Coach and GM Punch Imlach was known for being tough on his players, but his demanding style brought results. The Leafs played a defense-first, hard-nosed and opportunistic style of hockey, a reflection of Imlach's philosophy and the skill of players like Keon, one of the best defensive forwards in the league, and Horton, a strong physical presence on the blue line. Goaltending was another major strength. Johnny Bower, who was in the 40s at this time, was still elite, and veteran Terry Sawchuk sharing the crease. In 1965, the Bower-Sawchuk duo won the Vezina Trophy together for allowing the fewest goals in the league. Off the ice, the team was going through major changes in its ownership. In 1961, Conn Smythe's son, Stafford, along with business partners Harold Ballard and John Bassett, took full control of the franchise. While they let Imlach run the hockey operations without interference, conflicts between the owners soon began to grow. By the late 1960s, Smythe and Ballard pushed Bassett out of the group, a power struggle that would have big consequences for the Leafs in the 1970s. At the same time, a major shift was happening across the league. The NHL announced plans to expand in 1967, doubling in size from 6 to 12 teams. With expansion looming and concerns that the available talent would be spread more thinly, the Leafs ownership decided to make one last push for the championship before the league changed forever. By the 1966-67 season, the Leafs core was aging. Players like George Armstrong, Red Kelly, Terry Sawchuk, and Johnny Bower were approaching 40. Toronto had a mediocre regular season, finishing 3rd in the 6-team league. But when the playoffs began, this veteran team had one last incredible run left in them. The 1967 playoffs would go down in history. It was the NHL's final season before the expansion, and fittingly, the Stanley Cup final featured the Toronto Maple Leafs against their longtime rivals, the Montreal Canadiens. Montreal entered the series as heavy favorites. They were younger, faster, and had finished first in the standings. But the veteran Leafs, drawing on experience, grit and determination, pulled off a stunning upset, defeating the Canadiens in 6 games to win the 1967 Stanley Cup. Toronto lost the first 2 games of the series, but came roaring back, winning 4 of the next 5. Game 3 was a turning point, with veteran Bob Pulford scoring the double overtime winner. In Game 6, played in Toronto, Jim Pappin scored the cup-clinching goal. Dave Keon was awarded the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP for his outstanding two-way play, especially his ability to shut down the Montreal's Canadiens' top scorers. The 1967 championship was the Maple Leafs' 13th Stanley Cup and one of the most beloved. It came during Canada's centennial year against their greatest rival and featured many of the Leafs veterans playing their final season. It was the perfect ending to the Toronto's dynasty of the 1960s. But no one knew it was also the end of an era. Following that triumph, NHL expanded to 12 teams, creating a new landscape of competition. The Leafs, the oldest team in the league, quickly began to decline. Punch Imlach, loyal to his aging veterans, stuck with them for too long. By 1968, Toronto missed the playoffs, and in 1969, Imlach was fired after tensions grew in the locker room. Veterans like Tim Horton were frustrated with his demanding style, and young players weren't developing under his leadership. Ownership troubles also emerged in 1971, as Stafford Smythe died suddenly whilst under investigation for financial misconduct. This left Harold Ballard in control of the team, a shift that would define the trouble of the 1970s for the franchise. Despite the decline that followed, the Maple Leafs of the 1960s left a lasting legacy. They won 4 Stanley Cups in 1962, 63, 64, and 67, and were a constant cup contender. Their rosters were stacked with future Hall of Famers, including Frank Mahovlich, Dave Keon, Tim Horton, Johnny Bower, Terry Sawchuk, Red Kelly, Alan Stanley, and George Armstrong. The 1967 Stanley Cup remains Toronto's most recent championship, a fact that becomes more bittersweet with each passing decade, but the victory and the incredible run that came before it forever cemented the 1960s Maple Leafs as one of the greatest hockey teams in history. Before we get into the 1970s, if you're still watching the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. This video took a lot of time to make, and any and all support would be greatly appreciated. Subscribing is free, you can unsubscribe at any time, and thank you. Let's get into the 1970s. The 1970s were a turbulent decade for the Toronto Maple Leafs, filled with off-ice drama, controversial ownership, and mixed results on the ice. After their 1967 Stanley Cup win, the Leafs entered the newly expanded NHL with an aging roster and quickly began to fall behind. The early part of the decade was shaped by the aftermath of the late 60s. Punch Imlach was gone. Many of the Dynasty-era players had either retired or been traded, and a new generation was expected to lead the way. The Leafs still made the playoffs in 1967 to 68, and 68 to 69, thanks in part to the presence of weaker expansion teams. However, they were knocked out in the first round, both times. Following the 1969 playoff exit, team chairman Stafford Smythe made a bold move by firing Punch Imlach, the tough, no-nonsense coach and general manager who led Toronto to 4 Stanley Cups. His departure officially closed the book on the Leafs' 1960s dynasty. A turning point came in 1971, when the team's ownership structure drastically changed. In February of that year, minority owner John Bassett sold his shares to partners Harold Ballard and Stafford Smythe, giving them full control. Just months later, in October 1971, Stafford died unexpectedly from a bleeding ulcer. As the executor of Smythe's estate, Ballard acquired his late partner's shares by 1972, becoming the majority owner of the Maple Leafs and Maple Leaf Gardens. Ballard was a polarizing and eccentric figure, and his reign would cast a long shadow over the franchise for the next 2 decades. Almost immediately after taking control, Ballard was convicted of fraud and tax evasion for illegally using Leafs funds for personal expenses. In 1972, he was sent to prison for over a year. But even from his jail cell, he continued to make decisions about the team. Ballard became known for being tight with player salaries and constantly interfering in team operations. His controlling and unpredictable nature often put him at odds with coaches, general managers, and players, creating a chaotic atmosphere within the organization. On the ice, the 1970s were a rebuilding period for the Toronto Maple Leafs, focusing on youth and long-term potential. One of the biggest bright spots was the arrival of Darryl Sittler, drafted 8th overall in 1970. Sittler, a skilled center with natural leadership, gradually became the heart of the team and its future captain. Another major addition came in 1973 with the signing of Börje Salming, a talented Swedish defenseman who quickly became one of the NHL's first European stars. Salming impressed fans and critics alike with his skill, toughness, and ability to adapt to the North American game. He also paved the way for more European players to join the league in the years to come. The Leafs also drafted winger Lanny McDonald, 4th overall in 1973, and defenseman Ian Turnbull, while acquiring fan favorite enforcer Dave Williams. Together, this group formed a promising young core. During the 1972-73 season, however, the team struggled and finished near the bottom of the standings. Part of the decline came from Ballard's refusal to pay to keep certain players, which weakened the roster's depth. The upside was a high draft pick, which Toronto used to select Lanny McDonald. General manager Jim Gregory, one of the most forward-thinking GMs of the decade, played a key role in rebuilding the team. He was responsible for scouting and signing both Salming and his fellow Swede Inge Hammerstrom, a bold move at the time that paid off. By the mid-1970s, the Leafs were back to being a strong playoff team, though they weren't yet serious cup contenders. The NHL had expanded to 16 teams and later 18, which meant more playoff spots, and Toronto took advantage of this. Under head coach Red Kelly, a Hall of Famer who helped the team win cups as a player, the Leafs made the playoffs every year from 1974 onward. Although they ran into the powerhouse teams like the Broad Street Bullies of Philadelphia and the Montreal Canadiens Dynasty of late 70s, which limited their playoff runs, the Leafs still created plenty of memorable moments and hard-fought series. In the 1975-76 season, the Leafs showed real signs of growth, with Darryl Sittler, now the team captain, and Lanny McDonald both scoring 36 goals in the regular season. Toronto won an exciting first-round playoff series against the Los Angeles Kings. They were eventually eliminated, though, in the second round by the powerful Philadelphia Flyers. During that playoff run, coach Red Kelly made headlines for using pyramid power. He placed small pyramids in the locker room, claiming they helped focus the team's energy. This quirky tactic caught the fans' attention. The high point of the Leafs' 1970s playoff runs came in the 1977-78 season. By then, Roger Neilson had replaced Kelly as the head coach and brought a modern, defense-oriented system to the team. Toronto's roster had matured. Sittler was in his prime and among the league's top scorers. McDonald had become a proven clutch performer, and Salming was recognized as one of the NHL's best defensemen and a runner-up for the Norris Trophy. Tiger Williams added toughness, and goaltender Mike Palmateer, known for his flashy, acrobatic style, had become a fan favorite. In the 1978 playoffs, the Leafs pulled off a major upset by defeating the heavily favored New York Islanders in a dramatic 7-game quarterfinal series. The moment of glory came in overtime of Game 7, when Lanny McDonald scored the series-winning goal, instantly becoming a Leafs hero. The victory sent Toronto to the Stanley Cup semifinals, the deepest playoff run they had made since the 1967 championship. However, their next opponent was the Montreal Canadiens, in the middle of one of the most dominant dynasties in NHL history. Led by stars like Guy Lafleur and Ken Dryden, Montreal swept the Leafs in 4 games. Still, just reaching the semifinals was a major accomplishment in an era dominated by the Canadiens, Flyers, and Bruins. That same playoff run also featured one of the most bizarre off-ice moments of the Harold Ballard era. Ballard had clashed with coach Roger Neilson and actually fired him late in the season. But after backlash from fans and players, Ballard asked Neilson to return. At first, Ballard wanted Neilson to wear a paper bag over his head as a mystery coach to entertain the crowd, an idea that Neilson refused. Ballard eventually relented, rehiring Nelson without stunt. Nielsen's dramatic reinstatement and the Leafs' surprising playoff run became part of the team legend, perfectly capturing the chaos and unpredictability that defined the Maple Leafs during the Ballard years. By the end of the 1970s, trouble was once again brewing for the Toronto Maple Leafs. The relationship between owner Harold Ballard and his star players began to break down. Ballard's tight spending, unpredictable leadership, and resistance to player empowerment led to growing tensions, especially as the NHL's Players Association was gaining strength. One of the most strained relationships was with captain Darryl Sittler. In 1979, Ballard brought back Punch Imlach as general manager, hoping to restore discipline and control. But Imlach's return proved rocky. He quickly clashed with Sittler, whom he believed had too much influence over the team. Sittler's agent, Alan Eagleson, also happened to be head of the Players Union, which further annoyed the Leafs management. In a move widely seen as an attempt to undermine Sittler's leadership, Imlach traded Sittler's close friend and linemate Lanny McDonald to the struggling Colorado Rockies in December 1979. The trade devastated the locker room. In protest, Sittler famously removed the captain's C from his jersey. The fanbase was furious, and the team's performance took a hit. The Leafs were eliminated in the first round of the 1980 playoffs, and things only got worse from there. Imlach suffered a heart attack in 1981 and stepped down as GM, but the damage had already been done. The team began to fall apart. Sittler, increasingly unhappy, eventually requested a trade and was dealt in early 1982. officially ending an era. Other key players from the late 70s were also gone. Tiger Williams had been traded in 1980 in exchange for Rick Wave, who became a productive scorer but couldn't fill the leadership void. With McDonald, Williams, and Sittler all gone, the team had lost its identity. Despite moments of hope during the decade, the Leafs never made it to the Stanley Cup final in the 1970s. In fact, after their 1967 championship, they wouldn't reach another final for the rest of the 20th century. The term Ballard Years is often used to describe the 1970s to 1980s, a period defined by instability, questionable management, and unrealized potential. Between 1970 to 71 and 1981 to 82, the Leafs failed to post a single winning season, 12 straight years of mediocrity that marked one of the most frustrating stretches in team history. Despite all the changes of the 1970s, the decade still produced some of the most beloved players in Maple Leafs history. Sittler remains one of the franchise's all-time greats. On February 7, 1976, he delivered one of the most unforgettable performances in NHL history, recording 10 points in a single game, 6 goals and 4 assists during an 11-4 win over the Boston Bruins at Maple Leaf Gardens. It remains the NHL record for most points in a game, and is often remembered as the defining moment of the decade for the Leafs. Even in those difficult times, that night showed how individual brilliance could still lift the spirits of Toronto fans. Another fan favorite was Salming, the blazing Swedish defenseman who broke the barriers for European players in the NHL. Known for his skill, toughness, and consistency, Salming earned immense respect throughout the league. A standout moment came during the 1976 Canada Cup, when the fans at Maple Leaf Gardens gave him a spontaneous standing ovation, a gesture that was reflected how deeply he was admired in Toronto. The 1978 playoff run also gave fans something to celebrate, especially the dramatic Game 7 overtime win over the New York Islanders. That series win and Lanny McDonald's iconic goal offered a glimpse of what could have been in a more stable era. If the 1970s were a difficult era for the Toronto Maple Leafs, the 1980s were in many ways even worse. This decade was often referred to as the lowest point in franchise history. Under chaotic ownership of Harold Ballard, the Leafs became known for dysfunction, tight budgets, and poor results on the ice. Coaches and GMs came and went at rapid pace, and on most nights, the brightest moments came from a few standout players, not from team success. This decade was marked by frequent playoff failures, and in many seasons the team didn't make the playoffs at all. Yet in a strange way, it was also a period of slow, painful rebuilding that would eventually lead to the change in the 1990s. The early 80s continued the decline that began in the late 70s. When Sittler was traded in January 1982, the last link of the glory years of the 60s and early 70s was severed. That season, the Leafs finished dead last in the league. Still due to the playoff format at the time, where 16 of the 21 teams qualified, even weak teams sometimes made the postseason. In 1982, the Leafs reached the playoffs, despite a terrible 20-44-16 record, only to be swept in the first round. This became a recurring theme. Toronto made the playoffs again in 1983, 86, and 87, and also 88, largely because they were in the Norris division, where other teams like Detroit in the early 80s also struggled. These playoff appearances were more about geography than quality. The Leafs were not true contenders. One statistic sums up the Leafs' struggles during this period, from 1980 to 81 through 1992 to 93. The team didn't post a single winning season. Points percentages were regularly under .450, and fan frustration grew louder year after year. Much of the blame fell on Harold Ballard. His refusal to spend time on talent, constant interference in hockey operations, and outdated management style left the team floundering. Scouting and player development also suffered. Many high draft picks failed to develop into stars, and some were traded away without a clear plan. Yet despite the gloom of the 1980s, there were still a few bright spots and memorable players that gave Maple Leafs fans reasons to cheer. Rick Vaive was one of the decade's top performers. Acquired in a 1980 trade for fan favorite Tiger Williams, Vaive became the first player in Leafs history to score 50 goals in a season, and he did so 3 years in a row, peaking at 54 goals. A strong, quick-shooting power forward, Vaive was one of the league's top scorers during his prime. He was named team captain in 1981 at just 22 years old. However, the team's lack of success and some off-ice concerns led to him being stripped of the captain role in 1986. He was eventually traded in 1987. Other offensive contributors included Bill Derlago, and John Anderson, who could both score but often struggled defensively. Miroslav Fričera, a skilled Czech winger, added a bit of flair to the mid-80s teams. On the back end, Börje Salming remained a steady presence through the early part of the decade. While no longer at his peak, he was still a reliable defenseman and a fan favorite, and also a mentor to the younger players. His loyalty to the struggling franchise only added to his legendary status in Toronto. Though playoff appearances were rare, when the Leafs did make it, they occasionally delivered surprise performances. In 1985-86, despite winning only 25 games in the regular season, Toronto stunned the Chicago Blackhawks in the first round of the playoffs, sweeping the series 3-0. Goaltender Ken Riggett and the team briefly overachieved. In the second round, the Norris Division Final, the Leafs pushed the St. Louis Blues to 7 games, coming just 1 game away from reaching the conference final, despite a losing record. A similar run happened in 1986-87. The Leafs finished with a 32-42-6 record, but upset the Blues again in the first round, thanks to clutch goaltending from Alan Bester and the emergence of Wendell Clark, the team's first overall pick in 1985. In the second round, the Leafs gave the Detroit Red Wings all they could handle, forcing a Game 7 series before falling just short. Wendell Clark became the face of the team during the late 1980s. Drafted as a tough physical forward, he quickly won over the fans with his fearless, high-impact style. He scored 34 goals as a rookie in the 1985-86 season, and soon became an alternative captain. While known for his big hits and fights, he had a powerful and accurate shot, and was a legitimate offense threat when healthy. His leadership and toughness made him a fan favorite, and a symbol of hope during the bleak era. Behind the bench, the Leafs went through coaches with little success. Mike Nikoluk, Dan Maloney, John Brophy all had turns behind the bench, but none could turn the team into a consistent winner. Later in the decade, former Leafs captain George Armstrong and then Doug Carpenter had brief stints as head coach. In the front office, GM Jerry McNamara oversaw much of the team's decline. In 1988, Gord Stellick was named general manager at just 30 years old, becoming the youngest GM in NHL history. But his time was short-lived. He resigned after only 1 year, reportedly again due to Ballard's constant interference. In one infamous case, Ballard traded the player Ken Yaremchuk without even informing Stellick. Ballard's hold on the Toronto Maple Leafs only came to an end with his death in April 1990. Throughout the 80s, he ignored calls to sell the team or make meaningful changes, and the Leafs' continued struggles reflected that stubbornness. Fan frustration reached a boiling point. Maple Leaf Gardens, once a guaranteed sellout, saw its first non-sellout since 1946. The crowd regularly voiced its anger, whether through chants, empty seats, or infamous moments like the time when a fan threw a pig's head onto the ice in protest of Ballard's leadership in 1982. By the end of the decade, the Maple Leafs had become one of the league's worst teams. In the 1988-89 season, they won just 28 games and missed the playoffs. There were glimpses of talent from young players like Vincent Damphus and Gary Leeman, who showed potential, with Leeman scoring 50 goals in the 1989-90 season. But it was clear the franchise needed a major overhaul. The only upside to the poor performances was the high draft picks. In 1989, the Leafs selected Swedish forward Mats Sundin first overall, though they would trade his rights to Quebec in a deal that brought Wendell Clark back to Toronto. That same year, a major off-ice change occurred. The team's ownership led to a new group, led by Steve Stavro and the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. This marked the beginning of a cultural shift and the slow process of modernizing the franchise. The 1990s began much like the previous decade, with the Maple Leafs still struggling, but they soon transformed into a period of rejuvenation and renewed excitement, especially in the early to mid-90s. The passing of Harold Ballard in 1990 marked the end of one of the most chaotic chapters in the team's history. In his place, longtime associate Steve Stavro took control of the team and committed to turn things around. One of his major decisions was hiring Cliff Fletcher as his general manager in 1991. Fletcher had recently built a Stanley Cup winning team in Calgary and was known as a bold and savvy hockey executive. He was given full authority to rebuild the Leafs and wasted no time. Fletcher made a series of bold trades and roster moves that quickly reshaped the franchise. The biggest came on January 2nd, 1992, when he pulled off one of the largest trades in NHL history, a 10-player deal with the Calgary Flames. In that trade, Toronto acquired Doug Gilmour, a gritty and relentless two-way center who would become the heart and soul of the team. Gilmore's leadership, work ethic, and offensive talent instantly gave the Leafs a new identity. Along Gilmore, Toronto also received key veterans like Jamie McCown and Rick Nattrass on defense, as well as goalie Grant Furr, a 5-time Stanley Cup champion with the Edmonton Oilers. These additions brought championship experience and credibility to the locker room. In 1993, Fletcher added another key piece forward, Dave Andreychuk, a big-bodied winger with a natural scoring touch around the net. The Leafs were starting to build a dangerous mix of toughness, scoring, and leadership. Toronto's draft picks were beginning to make an impact as well. Felix Potvin, drafted in 1990, emerged as a talent. Nikolai Borshevsky, a late round pick from the USSR, proved to be a hidden gem and would play a huge role in the playoffs. Perhaps just as important as the roster moves was the hiring of Pat Burns as head coach in 1992. A former police officer and Jack Adams award-winning coach in Montreal, Burns brought a tough, structured, and a nonsense approach. He demanded accountability, strengthened the team's defensive play, and helped turn the Leafs into a confident and disciplined squad. Together, Fletcher and Burns laid the foundation for one of the most exciting and competitive eras in modern Leafs history, one that would soon deliver thrilling playoff runs and restore hope in the long-suffering fanbase. The draft was yielding talent as well. 1989 draftee Matt Sudin, a highly skilled center, was still with Quebec, but would soon favor into Toronto's plans. The Leafs also picked up goalie Felix Potvin and forward Nikolai Borshevsky, who would play big roles in the playoffs. Everything came together for the Toronto Maple Leafs in the 1992-93 season, which remains as one of the most exciting and beloved campaigns in franchise history. Toronto finished with 99 points, their best season in decades, and entered the playoffs with confidence and momentum. Doug Gilmour had a season for the ages. He scored 127 points, 32 goals, and 95 assists, setting a new franchise record, and was awarded the Selke Trophy as NHL's top defensive forward. He played in all situations and was the emotional and strategic engine of the team. Dave Andreychuk, acquired mid-season, was an immediate impact player, scoring 25 goals in just 31 games. Wendell Clark, back from injury and now playing wing, scored 46 goals and brought physicality and leadership. Players like John Cullen, Dave Ellett, and Todd Gill added depth and determination. In the 1993 playoffs, the Leafs went on a dramatic and unforgettable run. In the first round, the Campbell Conference quarterfinal, Toronto faced the heavily favored Detroit Red Wings. After falling behind 2-0 in the series, the Leafs stormed back to force a Game 7. In the deciding game in Detroit, Nikolai Borshevsky scored the series-winning goal in overtime by tipping in a point shot, one of the most iconic goals in playoff history. The upset sent shockwaves through the league and triggered wild celebrations in Toronto. In the Campbell Conference semifinal, the Leafs squared off against the St. Louis Blues, coached by Brian Sutter, brother of former Leafs rival and GM Punch Imlach's old adversary. The series was tight, physical, and stretched the full 7 games. One of the most memorable moments came in Game 1, when Doug Gilmour scored a spectacular double overtime wraparound goal, a moment that remained legendary among Leafs fans. Gilmour continued to lead the way, and Toronto eventually defeated the St. Louis Blues in Game 7, advancing to the conference final. It marked the first time since 1967 that the Leafs had won 2 playoff series in one postseason. In the 1993 conference final, the Toronto Maple Leafs faced the Los Angeles Kings, led by none other than Wayne Gretzky. This series quickly became one of the most dramatic and controversial in NHL history. Fans across Canada were dreaming of a classic Maple Leafs versus Canadiens Stanley Cup final, as Montreal had already advanced from the eastern side. The series itself was a thriller. Toronto took a 3-2 series lead thanks to a spectacular play from Doug Gilmour and strong goaltending from rookie Felix Potvin. Gilmour was everywhere, killing penalties, making big plays, and carrying the team with his two-way excellence. Then came Game 6 in LA, a game that would go down in infamy. With the game tied 4-4 late in regulation, Wayne Gretzky clipped Doug Gilmour in the face with his stick, drawing blood. Under NHL rules at the time, it should have been a 5-minute major penalty, but the referee, Kerry Fraser, chose not to make the call, a decision that remains one of the most debated non-calls in hockey history. Just moments later, Gretzky won a face-off and scored the overtime winning goal, forcing a Game 7. The Leafs were one win away from the Stanley Cup final, and many believed that the penalty, if called, could have changed everything. In Game 7, back in Toronto, Gretzky delivered a masterclass. He scored 3 goals and added an assist in a 5-4 win sending the Kings to the Stanley Cup final and ending Toronto's magical run just one game short. For Leafs fans, the heartbreak was immense, and many still point to the missed penalty in Game 6 as the moment that cost the team a shot at the cup. The Gretzky high stick incident became legendary, a moment etched into the collective memory of a fan base still waiting to return to the final. Despite the loss, Doug Gilmour's performance in the 1993 playoffs was nothing short of incredible. He finished with 35 points in 21 games, cementing his status as one of the greatest Maple Leafs of all time. The Maple Leafs proved that their 1993 playoff run was no fluke by putting together another strong season in 1993-94. They started the year red hot, setting a franchise record with 10 straight wins to open the season. Wendell Clark had a career year, scoring 46 goals, and the team got a boost at the trade deadline by acquiring veteran forward Mike Gartner. Toronto finished the regular season with 98 points, once again looking like a contender. In the playoffs, the Leafs defeated the Chicago Blackhawks in 6 games in the first round. They then faced the surprising San Jose Sharks in the second round. The series turned out to be much closer than expected, going the full 7 games. In Game 7, Felix Potvin came up huge, recording a 3-0 shutout to send the Leafs back to the conference final. Toronto now faced the Vancouver Canucks in the 1994 Western Conference Final, making their second straight appearance at the stage. However, injuries and fatigue began to catch up with the Leafs. Vancouver, led by Pavel Bure and goalie Kirk McLean, outplayed Toronto and won the series in 5 games. The Leafs came up short once again. Major changes followed in the offseason. In a blockbuster trade, Toronto sent fan favorites captain Wendell Clark to the Quebec Nordiques in a package deal for the rights to Mats Sundin, a 23-year-old Swedish star and former first overall pick. While many fans were heartbroken to see Clark go, he had been a long and emotional core of the team. Sundin was viewed as a future franchise center and cornerstone for the years to come. Also arriving in the trade was defenseman Garth Butcher, while Toronto sent the young forward Sylvain Lafay to Quebec. Meanwhile, coach Pat Burns, who had gotten the most out of the team during his 3 seasons behind the bench, saw the team begin to struggle. In the lockout-shortened 1995 season, the Leafs missed the playoffs, and Burns was let go in 1996. Doug Gilmour, still playing at an elite level, remained a leader and continued to give his all. But with the roster shifting, the Leafs could not replicate the magic of their 1992-94 peak. By this time, Matt Sundin had emerged as the team's clear-cut number 1 center and was named captain in 1997, following the trade of Doug Gilmour to the New Jersey Devils. Sundin's consistent scoring, quiet leadership, and clutch performances would define the Maple Leafs for the next decade. The Leafs added key players during this time, including winger Steve Thomas and goaltender Curtis Joseph, who was signed as a free agent in 1998. Joseph quickly became a fan favorite and provided the Leafs with elite goaltending, something the franchise hadn't had on a consistent basis since the days of Johnny Bower. Off the ice, huge changes were taking place. In February 1999, the Maple Leafs said goodbye to the Maple Leaf Gardens, their home arena of 68 years, and moved into the modern Air Canada Centre. The final game at the Gardens was an emotional and historic night, with team legends in attendance and tributes to the many memories created there. Around the same time, the Leafs merged ownership with the NBA's Toronto Raptors, forming Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, or MLSE for short. This move brought the team greater financial stability and set the stage for a more modern, corporate era of Maple Leafs hockey. On the ice, the Leafs remained competitive. They made the playoffs in 1996, 97, but were eliminated in the first round both times. After missing the playoffs in 1998, the hiring of Pat Quinn sparked a turnaround. In 1998-99, the Leafs finished with 97 points, led by Sundin's 83 points and Steve Thomas's 28 goals. In the playoffs, they defeated the Philadelphia Flyers in the first round, then beat the Pittsburgh Penguins in 6 games to advance to the Eastern Conference Final. There they ran into the Buffalo Sabres and Dominic Hasek, who was unbeatable in net. Buffalo won the series in 5 games, but Toronto had re-established itself as a contender. The 1999 season also marked another milestone. Toronto hit the 100-point mark for the first time in franchise history and won their first division title since 1963. The Air Canada Centre hosted its first playoff series, with the Leafs defeating the Ottawa Senators in the first round, the beginning of what would become known as the Fierce Battle of Ontario. Toronto repeated defeat in both 2000 and 2001, eliminating Ottawa in the first round each time, only to fall in the second round to the New Jersey Devils, who went on to win the Stanley Cup in 2000 and reached the final again in 2001. The late 90s Leafs were defined by a mix of veteran leadership and emerging talent. Matt Sundin hit his prime and was constantly the team's top scorer, leading by example and coming through big moments, including numerous overtime game winners. Curtis Joseph gave the Leafs confidence in net, while Pat Quinn brought stability behind the bench, coaching a tough, physical team that could also produce offensively. The Maple Leafs entered the new millennium as a strong contender in the Eastern Conference, still led by head coach Pat Quinn and captain Matt Sundin. In the 2001-02 season, Toronto fielded a deep, veteran roster. Sundin once again led the team in scoring, while a rejuvenated Alexander Mogolny tallied 76 points, bringing speed and skill to the top line. In goal, Curtis Joseph remained a steady presence as the Leafs finished with 100 points. The playoffs brought more drama. Toronto defeated both the New York Islanders and Ottawa Senators in a grueling 7-game series. The win over Ottawa marking the third straight year the Leafs eliminated their rivals. The playoff run pushed the Leafs into the Eastern Conference Final against the upstart Carolina Hurricanes. However, injuries took a major toll. Sundin missed most of the playoffs with a broken wrist, and several other key players were hurt. Despite the setbacks, the Leafs battled on. Gary Roberts delivered a gutsy, physical playoff performance, and depth players like Alan McCauley stepped up in key moments. Still, the banged-up Leafs fell to Carolina in 6 games, a disappointing end to a brave playoff push. In the summer of 2002, Curtis Joseph departed via free agency, and the Leafs brought in veteran netminder Ed Belfour, and the move paid off. In the 2002-2003 season, Belfour played at a Vezina Trophy caliber level, and Toronto finished with 98 points. But the season ended in heartbreak, as they lost to a 7-game first-round series to the Philadelphia Flyers. The 2003-04 season was one of the best regular seasons in franchise history. The Leafs then set a franchise record with 103 points, and finished with the 4th best record in the league. Sundin continued to lead the way, supported by a strong core that included Alexander Mogolny, Gary Roberts, Joe Nieuwendyk, and Brian McCabe. In the playoffs, Toronto faced Ottawa in the first round for the 4th time in 5 years, and once again they came out on top, with Ed Belfour posting 3 shutouts, including a Game 7 gem. In the second round, however, Toronto's momentum stalled. They faced the Philadelphia Flyers for the 2nd year straight and were eliminated in 6 games. That 2004 playoff defeat marked the end of an era. It was the last time the Maple Leafs would win a playoff series for many years to come. The entire 2004-2005 season was cancelled due to the lockout. When the NHL returned in 2005-2006, it introduced a new salary cap, and the Maple Leafs, with an aging roster, struggled to adjust. Matt Sundin, still the captain and the premier talent, continued to lead the team. But despite his efforts, Toronto missed the playoffs in both 2006 and 2007, beginning what would become the longest playoff drought in franchise history. Sundin remained productive, becoming the first player in team history to record 400 goals and 900 points. He was supported by emerging players like Thomas Kaberle and Darcy Tucker, but it wasn't enough. By 2008, it was clear a rebuild was needed. Sundin, the face of the franchise for over a decade, left as a free agent after refusing to waive his non-trade clause at the deadline. He stated he didn't want to be a rental player elsewhere, a decision that was controversial to some, but seen by many as a sign of loyalty. He left Toronto as the franchise all-time leader in goals and points. During the late 2000s, the Leafs began a full overhaul. Ownership changes placed Richard Petty and the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan in control of MLSE. In late 2000, Toronto hired Hall of Famer Brian Burke as general manager. He promised a tougher and more aggressive team, and quickly made headlines. In 2009, he traded young sniper Phil Kessel, sending 2 first-round picks to Boston, a move that became highly debated when Toronto's struggles turned those picks into valuable assets for the Bruins. Around the same time, the Leafs also sent their 2009 first-round pick to the New York Islanders as part of a package deal to acquire Luke Schenn the year before, another move questioned. Toronto also continued cycling through head coaches, firing Paul Morris in 2008 and hiring Ron Wilson, among others, in a search for stability behind the bench. But from 2005 to 2006 through 2011 to 12, the Leafs failed to qualify for the playoffs for 7 straight seasons, the longest drought in franchise history, and a constant source of frustration for their massive fan fanbase. Despite the on-ice failures, the fan interest never faded. Toronto constantly led the league in attendance and TV ratings, a testament to the franchise's enduring importance in Canadian hockey culture. Signs of hope did emerge. The Leafs drafted Nazem Kadri in 2009 and added promising young pieces like Dion Phaneuf, who was acquired in a 2010 trade and named team captain later that year. Off the ice, major changes were taking place. In 2012, the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan sold its majority stake in MLSE to a partnership between Bell Canada and Rogers Communications, two of the country's telecom giants. With the new ownership came a shift in philosophy, one that emphasized a long-term, patient rebuild. At last, in the lockout-shortened 2012 to 13 season, the Toronto Maple Leafs returned to the playoffs, ending their 7th-season drought, the longest in franchise history. The team was led by a new generation of stars, including Phil Kessel, James Van Riemsdyk, Joffrey Lupul, and goaltender James Reimer. Toronto finished 5th in the Eastern Conference, showing signs that the rebuild was finally working. In the first round of the playoffs, the Leafs faced Boston Bruins, reigniting an old Original Six rivalry. The series was tight and went the full 7 games. In Game 7, in Boston, the Leafs built a 4-1 lead with under 11 minutes to play and looked poised to win their first playoff series since 2004. Then came one of the most stunning collapses in NHL history. The Bruins scored 3 goals in the final 10 minutes of regulation, including 2 goals in the final minute with their net empty. In overtime, Patrice Bergeron scored the game winner, capping an unbelievable comeback and handing the Leafs a devastating 5-4 loss. The collapse was a crushing blow for the team and its fans, blowing a 3-goal, third-period lead in Game 7. Still, the series marked a turning point. After nearly a decade, the Leafs had finally returned to the playoffs. Their young core gained valuable postseason experience, and there was a renewed sense of urgency and ambition within the organization. That summer brought more changes. In April 2014, Toronto hired Brendan Shanahan, a Hall of Famer and Stanley Cup winning executive, as team president. His arrival signaled a long-term vision to build a sustainable winner and restore the Maple Leafs to their former glory. The arrival of Brendan Shanahan as team president marked the beginning of what came to be known as the Shanaplan, a comprehensive, long-term rebuild built around drafting players, player development, and new organizational culture. The 2014 to 2015 season was difficult. The team struggled badly, and by early 2015, Shanahan was given the green light by the MLSE board to initiate a rebuild. This meant tearing down the roster and starting from scratch. Toronto cleaned the house, firing general manager Dave Nonis, Peter Horacek, and much of the front office and scouting staff after the season. In May 2015, the Leafs made a bold and widely praised move, hiring Mike Babcock, one of the NHL's most respected coaches, to an 8-year contract, the richest for a coach in the league at that time. Just 2 months later, in July 2015, Shanahan added further legitimacy to the rebuild by bringing in Lou Lamoriello, the legendary former GM of the New Jersey Devils, to run hockey operations. The Leafs now had a proven leadership group to guide the franchise through its most dramatic rebuild ever. Over the following year, the team began shedding high-salary veterans in exchange for draft picks and prospects. The most notable move was in July 2015, when Toronto traded star winger Phil Kessel to the Pittsburgh Penguins, receiving a package that included a first-round pick and prospect Kasperi Kapanen. Then in February 2016, the Leafs traded captain Dion Phaneuf to the Ottawa Senators in a multiplayer deal designed to clear cap space and acquire young assets. The Leafs hit rock bottom in 2015 to 2016, finishing 30th overall, last in the NHL, for the first time in franchise history. But there was a silver lining, the chance to draft a franchise-altering star. In April 2016, fortune favored Toronto as they won the NHL draft lottery and earned the number 1 pick. With the selection, they chose Austin Matthews, a skilled and powerful center from Arizona. Matthews became the centerpiece of Toronto's youth movement. He joined other top picks like William Nylander and Mitch Marner to form a dynamic and exciting young core, the one that would carry the Leafs into a new era of hope and competitiveness. The transformation was immediate. In 2016 to 2017, Austin Matthews, in his rookie season, helped the Leafs become one of the most exciting and watchable NHL teams. In his very first NHL game, Matthews made history by scoring 4 goals, the first NHL player in modern history to do so in a debut. The jaw-dropping performance made headlines around the hockey world. Matthews went to score 40 goals in that season and earned the Calder Trophy as the NHL's Rookie of the Year. He wasn't alone though. Fellow rookies Mitch Marner and William Nylander also had strong debut campaigns, each surpassing 60 points. Fueled by this youthful core, the Leafs improved by 26 points in the standings and clinched the wildcard playoff spot. In the 2017 playoffs, Toronto faced the Washington Capitals, the President's Trophy winners. Despite the daunting matchup, the Leafs played with poise and confidence. 5 of the 6 games went to overtime, and though Washington ultimately won, Toronto earned widespread recognition for their fearless play and rapid turnaround. The following season, 2017 to 2018, saw the Leafs take another leap. They set a new franchise record with 105 points, and their high-powered offense was among the league's best. Matthews scored 34 goals despite missing 20 games due to an injury, while Marner and Nylander continued to progress. In the summer of 2017, Toronto made a notable free agent signing, adding winger Patrick Marleau. He chipped in 27 goals and brought experience to the younger locker room. Once again, the Leafs met the Boston Bruins in the first round of the playoffs. It was a tightly contested series. Toronto battled back from a 3-1 series deficit to force a Game 7. However, just like in 2013, the Bruins prevailed, this time without a collapse, simply outplaying Toronto in the defensive game. Despite the loss, the Leafs were now firmly established as a team on the rise. Shortly after the season, Lou Lamoriello, then 75 years old, stepped down as general manager and moved into an advisory role. In May 2018, Brendan Shanahan promoted Kyle Dubas, a young, analysis-driven executive, to the GM role. The Leafs made one of the biggest moves of the 2018 offseason, signing superstar center and Toronto native John Tavares to a 7-year contract. Tavares chose to leave the New York Islanders to join his hometown team, giving Toronto a wealth of talent down the middle with Matthews, Tavares, and Kadri. The move paid off immediately. In the 2018 to 2019 season, Tavares scored a career-high 47 goals, while Matthews added 37 goals in just 68 games. Toronto reached the 100-point mark for the second time in franchise history and looked to make a deep playoff run. However, the playoff matchup was a familiar one. The Boston Bruins. Again, in the first round, for the third time in 7 years, the series went to 7 games, and for the third time, Boston came out on top. Toronto had led the series 3-2, but lost games 6 and 7, making for another bitter playoff exit. In October 2019, the Leafs named John Tavares team captain. Expectations were sky high entering the 2019-20 season, but by November, the team was underperforming. In a bold move, Brendan Shanahan fired head coach Mike Babcock and promoted Sheldon Keefe, head coach of the AHL Marlies, to take over. Under Keefe, the Leafs showed signs of improvement and played a more open, creative style. But before the regular season could be completed, the COVID-19 pandemic halted play in March 2020. When the NHL resumed that summer in a bubble environment, the league introduced a special qualifying round format. Toronto was matched against the Columbus Blue Jackets in a best-of-5 series. In a low-scoring, tightly contested matchup, the Leafs were eliminated in 5 games, failing to reach the traditional first round of the playoffs. While the loss was frustrating, the organization took the circumstances into account and chose to stay on course with Keefe and the core group in place. The 2020-21 NHL season was played under extraordinary circumstances due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. To limit travel, the NHL realigned into temporary, geographically based divisions, creating the one-time only North Division, which featured all 7 Canadian teams. The Maple Leafs thrived in this format. In the 56-game shortened season, they posted a 35-14-7 record, finishing first in the North Division. Austin Matthews had a dominant season, scoring 41 goals to lead the NHL and winning the Rocket Richard Trophy as the league's top goal scorer. He became the first Maple Leaf to officially win the Richard Trophy and the first Leaf to lead the NHL in goals since 1946. In playoffs, Toronto drew their oldest rival, the Montreal Canadiens, in the first round, their first playoff meeting since 1979. The Leafs were heavy favorites and jumped out to a 3-1 series lead. Then came another stunning collapse. Montreal won the next 3 games, eliminating Toronto in 7 games and launching their own Cinderella run to the 2021 Stanley Cup Final. Toronto's high-powered offense dried up at the worst possible time, and the defeat instantly ranking among the most painful in franchise history. Despite the crushing defeat, the Leafs front office remained committed to the core, and the team responded in 2021-22 with the best regular season in franchise history. Toronto finished with a 54-21-7 record, totaling 115 points, smashing the club's all-time marks. Austin Matthews was once again the centerpiece. He became the first Maple Leaf to ever score 60 goals goals in a season, and the first player in the NHL to do so in a decade. Matthews captured his second Rocket Richard trophy and also won the Hart Trophy as NHL MVP, becoming the first Leaf to do so since 1955. Mitch Marner had a career-best 97 points, and support cast including William Nylander and John Tavares and Michael Bunting delivered consistently. In the playoffs, the Leafs faced a challenge: the two-time defending Stanley Cup champion, the Tampa Bay Lightning. In yet again another 7-game series, Toronto once again fell just short, losing Game 7 at home 2-1. It marked the 5th straight season the Leafs were eliminated in a winner-take-all deciding game, an almost unthinkable stretch of playoff heartbreak. By this point, the Leafs' talented core had earned respect for their regular season brilliance, but they had become inseparable from a growing narrative of postseason frustration. The 2022-23 season saw the Leafs put together another strong campaign, finishing with 50 wins and 111 points, good for second place in the Atlantic Division, behind the record-setting Boston Bruins, with pressure mounting to finally deliver playoff success. Management bolstered the roster at the trade deadline, bringing in experienced veterans, most notably Ryan O'Reilly, a former Conn Smythe Trophy winner. In the playoffs, facing the Tampa Bay Lightning for the second straight year, Toronto won the series in 6 games, making the first playoff series victory in 19 years, their first since 2004. The series win ended the NHL's longest active streak without a playoff series victory. Fittingly, the series clinched Game 6 was decided in overtime, with captain John Tavares scoring the winner. Toronto also made history during the series by becoming the first team in the NHL history to win 3 overtime games on the road in a single playoff series, taking games 3, 4, and 6 in Tampa in extra time. In the second round, the Leafs ran into the red-hot Florida Panthers, who had just stunned the Bruins in round 1. Despite high hopes, Toronto was eliminated in 5 games, ending their run short of the Eastern Conference Final. While no longer a first-round exit, the second-round loss was still disappointing for a team with legitimate Stanley Cup aspirations. The defeat prompted front office changes. In May 2023, General Manager Kyle Dubas was not retained, ending his tenure with the team. Shortly after, the Leafs hired Brad Treliving, a former GM of the Calgary Flames, to take his place. Despite the change in management, the core remained intact. Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner, William Nylander, and John Tavares all returned for the 2023-24 season. And with the 2024-25 season still ongoing, this marks the entire history of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Over more than a century, the Toronto Maple Leafs have built one of the hockey's richest and most complex legacies. A story of triumph, heartbreak, and unwavering fan devotion. With 13 Stanley Cup championships, the NHL's second most successful franchise, only behind the Montreal Canadiens, their glory years, spanning from the 1918s to their last title in 1967, featured many legendary moments. But since then, the Leafs have endured the league's longest active championship drought, marked by decades of mismanagement, near misses, and playoff heartbreaks. Win or lose, the Leafs remain a defining force in hockey. And every spring, the same question echoes: is this finally the Leafs' year? If you made it to the end of the video, I really appreciate you. This video took very long to make, so if you did enjoy it, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It's free. You can unsubscribe at any time, and I really appreciate your support. Depending how this video does, I might do a video on all the original 6 NHL teams, so if that's something you guys are interested in seeing, then just let me know down in the comments. But again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.